What if one of Africa's biggest construction projects is actually the beginning of something much bigger? Ethiopia didn't just build a dam, it built a machine capable of turning one of Africa's most powerful rivers into electricity, and then use that electricity as part of a much larger plan for industrialization. But there is where the story gets interesting. This project didn't just attract engineers and construction workers, it attracted the attentions of neighboring countries, international institutions, politicians, and governments far beyond Africa. Why? Because when a country begins building infrastructure on this scale, it is no longer just constructing concrete and steel, it is building economic power. And the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam may be one of the clearest examples of African growing construction ambition. So how exactly did Ethiopia build this enormous structure? What happened behind the walls of dam? And more importantly, can a project like this trigger an industrial revolution? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Chapter 1. The project that changed the conversation. For many years, Africa had been portrayed as a continent waiting for someone else to build its future. But Ethiopia decided to attempt something different. Deep in the Blue Nile Basin, the country embarked on a project so numerous that it would eventually become one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in modern African history, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is not simply a wall of concrete holding back millions of cubic meters of water. It is a massive engineering project designed to transform water into electricity, electricity into industry, and infrastructure into economic power. And that is where the real story begins. Because when a country starts building projects of this scale, the question is no longer simple. Can Africa build? The question becomes, what happens when Africa begins building at scale? Chapter 2. Why Ethiopia needed a dam. Ethiopia possesses numerous water resources, but for years, access to reliable electricity remained a major obstacle to development. And electricity is more than something that turns on a light. It powers factories, it runs machines, it supports telecommunications, it allows businesses to operate for longer hours. It can power irrigation systems, transport infrastructure, and entire industrial zones. For Ethiopia, expanding electricity generation was therefore closely connected to a much bigger ambition: industrialization. The idea was simple: build infrastructure first, generate more electricity, then use that electricity to support economic activities on a much larger scale. But achieving that vision requires something enormous, and Ethiopia chose the Blue Nile. Chapter 3. Building a giant. Building a mega dam is nothing like constructing an ordinary building. Now, before the structure could rise, engineers had to deal with the river itself. The construction site requires enormous quantities of earth and rock to be moved. Access roads had to be developed. Construction areas had to be prepared. Materials had to be transported. The rivers had to be managed. And then came the concrete. Massive quantity of concrete were required to create the dam's enormous structure. Layers after layers, section after section, the project gradually transformed the landscape. Heavy machinery became a permanent feature of the construction site. Excavators dug into the earth, trucks moved materials, cranes lifted equipment, workers and engineers operated around structures that grew larger every year. What looked from a distance like a giant construction site was actually an enormous industrial operation. Because building a dam of these scales requires an entire network of industries behind it. Chapter 4. From concrete to electricity. Eventually, the purpose of all that construction comes into focus: electricity. Inside the powerhouse are numerous turbines and generators designed to convert the movement of water into electrical energy. Water moves through the system. The force turns turbines. The turbines drive generators, and the generators produce electricity. It sounds simple, but scaling that process to a massive national infrastructure project requires extraordinary engineering. The dam therefore represents something much bigger than water storage. It represents the conversion of a natural resources into industrial power. The industrial power can change an economy. A factory that previously struggles with unreliable electricity can operate more consistently. A new industrial facilities can be connected to the grid. Businesses can expand, cities can grow, and the communities that previously had limited access to electricity can potentially gain greater access. That is why energy infrastructure sits at the center of industrialization. Without electricity, modern industries struggles to grow. Chapter 5. The controversy. But the bigger Ethiopian project become, the more attention it attracted. The dam sits on the Blue Nile, a river that flows downstream into Sudan and Egypt, and that creates one of Africa's most complicated infrastructure debates. For Ethiopia, the dam represents development, electricity generation, and national ambition. For downstream countries, the concern has centered on how the filling and operation of such a massive reservoir could affect water flows. This transformed what began as an engineering project into a geopolitical issue, and suddenly the world was watching a construction site in Ethiopia. That controversy is important, but there is another part of the story that deserves just as much attention. The fact that an African country was undertaking a mega project of this magnitude, because infrastructure changes the conversation. When a country builds a road, it connects communities. When it builds a railway, it changes transportation. When it builds a port, it changes trade. And when it builds major power infrastructure, it creates the possibility for industries that require enormous amounts of electricity. Chapter 6. The dam is only one piece of the puzzle. The most important mistake would be to look at the dam as an isolated project. It is a part of much larger infrastructure story. Across Africa, governments are investing in roads, railways, airports, bridges, power plants, transmission network, industry parks, and other major infrastructure. And Ethiopia has pursued this approach aggressively. The objective is not simply to build impressive structure. The objective is to create systems. A road becomes valuable when it connects farms to market. A railway becomes more valuable when it moves people and goods efficiently. Electricity becomes economically powerful when it reaches factories and businesses. Infrastructure works as a network, and that network is what can eventually support industrialization. The last chapter, a new African construction era. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is therefore more than a giant structure on a Blue Nile. It represents a much bigger debate about Africa's future. For generations, the continent's development stories was often dominated by what Africa lacked. Not enough electricity, not enough infrastructure, not enough industrial capability, not enough manufacturing. But a different story is beginning to emerge. A story about countries attempting to build the infrastructure they believe they need to compete in the future. And Ethiopia's dam is one of the clearest examples. Concrete is the only beginning. The real objective is what comes after the concrete. More electricity, more industry, more manufacturing, more connectivity, and potentially a stronger foundation for African independence. The dam does not actually guarantee an industrial revolution. No single project can, but it can demonstrate something important. Africa is not simply waiting for the future to arrive. In many places, it is trying to build it, and perhaps the most important question is no longer whether Africa can construct mega projects. The question is, what will Africa build next? If you find this video informative, do well to like, subscribe, and drop your comment in the comment section. I will be there waiting for you. See you in my next video. Thanks for sticking out.